Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 28th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, the title being Result for Theory. The text follows. War is, therefore, not only chameleon-like in character because it changes its color in some degree in each particular case, but it is also, as a whole, in relation to the predominant tendencies which are in it, a wonderful trinity, composed of the original violence of its elements, hatred and animosity, which may be looked upon as blind instinct, of the play of probabilities and chance, which make it a free activity of the soul, and of the subordinate nature of a political instrument, by which it belongs purely to the reason. The first of these three phases concerns more the people, the second more the general and his army, the third more the government. The passions which break forth in a war must already have a latent existence in the peoples. The range which the display of courage and talents shall get into the realm of probabilities and of chance depends on the particular characteristics of the general and his army, but the political objects belong to the government alone. These three tendencies, which appear like so many different lawgivers, are deeply rooted in the nature of the subject, and at the same time variable in degree. A theory which would leave any of them out of account, or set up any arbitrary relation between them, would immediately become involved in such a contradiction with the reality that it might be regarded as destroyed at once by that alone. The problem is, therefore, that theory shall keep its poised in a manner between these three tendencies, as between 3 points of attraction. The way in which alone this difficult problem can be solved we shall examine in the book on the theory of war. In every case, the conception of war, as here defined, will be the first ray of light which shows us the true foundation of theory, and which first separates the great masses and allows us to distinguish them from one another. So, finally, we arrived to the final paragraph of the first chapter. That is of great importance because not only it summarizes the general conclusions of the inquiry that lasted throughout all the paragraph, but also introduces the Clausewitzian Trinity as a concept that is really fundamental, and that the author has already hinted at throughout the first chapter, but hasn't quite defined now so clearly. So, and obviously there is a further expansion of the explanation during the rest of the work. So, von Clausewitz said the theory, here the title, Result for Theory. So here it lays fundamentally into the realm of what we have to do with the conclusions that we have just drawn in the theoretical field in order to investigate, to study the just also the theory of war, but also war proper. And so always the theoretical dimension tied to the practical one, that is the ultimately the most important. So that you can't do without theory if you want to act in practice, but also theory is not undetached by practice, but it actually draws from it what is made of. So here von Clausewitz starts with a beautiful metaphor. The war is a chameleon-like is chameleon-like in character, right? So it basically has this capacity of changing. Chameleons change color. Here it's obviously a much deeper concept that has nothing to do with the color of war, but the color of war, in fact, metaphorically meant that war is fundamentally not a an activity that you can categorize as just according to just a trend or a particular dimension or aim or object, but it's always something changing. Chameleons not only can assume different colors, but also gradually pass from one color to another. So that is particularly important, because in turn war, just like chameleons, adapts to what is out there, what comes to influence it, and it's an active change, just like in the animal, because the animal recognizes the need to do it for safety, for a greater good, let's say, and war, being guided by politics, has the same effect. War fundamentally adapts to the political mandate and all to the other interferences, let's say, that occur that influence it, that shape and mold it fundamentally. So and it's chameleon-like in character because it changes its color in some degree in each particular case, keeping to quote von Clausewitz. But it's not only like that, but it is also, von Clausewitz says, as a whole, in relation to the predominant tendencies which are in it. A wonderful trinity composed of the original violence of its elements, hatred and animosity, which may be looked upon as a blind instinct. So here von Clausewitz starts with the first element of the trinity, explaining that this trinity fundamentally represents this predominant tendencies within war in itself. So not strictly into the military domain, to the field that objectively the use of violence has in the way it's exercised, and it passes from potential into act. But war as a whole is still dominated by those who perform that act of violence, the government, the people, so the various elements. So the first element of this trinity is the original violence of its elements, that is hatred and animosity. And hatred and animosity, von Clausewitz explains, are to be looked upon as blind instinct. So there is this dimension of war that we have already encountered in the chapter that it makes it all start from this instinctual feeling of enmity, that it's not just towards let's say someone, it's not just expressed by hatred or animosity towards someone specifically, or obviously can be, but it's not so rational. It's like more of a natural reaction that we have basically towards everything that happens around us. We are regulated in these terms for which we have to control our aggressiveness as much as we have the ability the need actually to unleash it if we want to progress, if we want to struggle into our daily life. So this instinct is not even properly something that represents war in itself. Actually, it's something that goes beyond, behavioral fashion, in the way we react, right? So that's why not all violence is war, and that, just to make a banal example, but also how effectively every relation that we are engaged in contains a certain amount of violence, of primordial violence, as von Clausewitz puts it. So it's something you can find even in other living beings, and this is particularly important because von Clausewitz hasn't quite invented anything new from this point of view. He has, naturally, the Trinity is a very original concept in Clausewitzian theory, but sticking to just to violence, and this idea that somehow there is violent instinct and reason that are always interacting, but they're separated, is something that you can find back up to very old times. I always make the example of Hellenic mythology, where you have Ares from one side and Athena from the other. And what happens is that these two deities are both deities of war. Actually, the most important deity of war is Athena, not Ares, interestingly enough, because Athena effectively makes war. It doesn't just fight. Ares represents really this primordial violence that is absolute, is unchained, unrestrained. It's the same violence that animals have, that use instinctively, and also kind of in Ares there is also the pride, the warrior-like behavior. Right now, this kind of violence is regularly crushed by reason, right? Even in the battlefield, because guess what? Warriors get their ass kicked by soldiers, historically speaking. And the myth of separating now that we have created for propagandistic reasons, that there are some soldiers that are warriors because they are the cool guys that really have it in their veins, it's all bullshit. Okay, in the theory of war, it's completely the other way around, and it's just also a gross not just a gross misinterpretation, but also a gross misuse of wording, because that's not what warriors are. And at the end of the day, that's also not what makes the whole thing working. And the real point is that war is a reasonable activity. It's a social activity directed with a reasonable aim. Wars are war is violence, but violence of peoples who have a social and political, most of all, organization, that therefore are able to extraneate, in part to detach the use of violence from the instinctual element. Not that in our world, in history, governments that are the ones who are deputed, in fact, to call for war, to make it, to have it fought, and make fully reasonable, take fully reasonable decisions, or are able to calculate everything just, logically, and it's not real. But at the same time, it's the most reasonable, let's say, decision that in war is effectively taken. So that's why also we need the hierarchies, why wars are fought by societies, but also especially by politically organized societies, and that's why also the same military has this share of it, if you want, so that even in the relation between the government and the military, you don't have really a perfect detachment, for which, from one side there is the reason, from the other one there is this, as we'll see now, this second element of the Trinity, that is the play of probabilities and chance, as if military men were just people who, like to bet or throw the dice. The military men are still part of the political side in some way. They're still part of the people, and vice versa in many ways. So what von Clausewitz is telling us here is that there are these predominant tendencies that and we will see now, especially at the end, that basically all interact with each other. So that there is a you can't focus just on one, pretending that war is either pure instinct or pure taste for gaming, or merely rational activity. It's obviously a combination of things that compensates all the others. But all these tendencies are very different in nature, so that you have a pretty well shaped and defined realm for each, a domain for each, that it can be ideal, because you can't in fact perfectly distinguish them, as we were saying, but at the same time you can identify them clearly to understand in which way they intervene. Going on, here we were talking about, excuse me, I was reading something else, but talking about Athena and Ares, that's particularly important to understand, because and I insist much on when I talk about von Clausewitz, because especially of this fashion of conceiving soldiers some allegedly elected soldiers as warriors, or considering the military as warriors. No, that's a seriously unhealthy, anti-historical, and anti-scientific, and anti-human or anthropological conception. It finds no place into reality, and the way it's flagged and waved, it's frankly disgusting. I'm sorry I transcend so potently, but I would like to make this point very, very, very clear. And military history does it for me. If you don't want to listen to me, just go look what happens when warriors and soldiers meet, right? And who gets wiped out most of the time. So it's interesting still because it's balanced. It's not an absolute rule. So you realize that von Clausewitz here is calling powerfully for an equilibrated view of the world. He says, there are these elements, as always, that you can trace in theory, but then in the practice they blend, and they blend indestructibly. Let me say, well, whatever. They can't be separated in any case. There is always a tiny bit of the other, at least in the others, in all the others as well. So where were we? Oh, yes. So this first element of the Trinity, original violence, primordial violence, right? Then there is the second, which is the play of probabilities and chance, which, according to von Clausewitz, make it a free activity of the soul, or the mind or the spirit. This, as we will see, will pertain chiefly to the military proper, to the military as the actual fighters, and it's this kind of even apparently frivolous character, right? This idea of just betting, playing on probabilities, and as we have seen in the first chapter, you can't, however, ever take away probability and chance out of the plan of war, the decisions you have to take even during the war itself. In other words, there is no certainty in absolute terms in war, in a real war, and there are just real ones. Sorry, if you thought it were fantasy wars, no, unfortunately not. Maybe on some comic or in some other read, but not really in reality. And it's important to get it right, in my opinion, because we like to play with the idea of war, but we don't really like to really focus on what it is. So that you say, oh well, but in this way you kill fantasy, you kill imagination. Well, okay, but the world is already so complicated the way it is. We have so much to figure out. What we try to commit ourselves to understand a bit of how it works, rather than influencing people to think otherwise, to think about just things that we actually already know are not to be true, and instead of spreading knowledge and awareness, but whatever. And then in the end there is the third element of the Trinity, which is the subordinate nature of a political instrument by which it belongs purely to the reason. So in war there is this other reasonable element that is the one that lays, I can't say it's arguably the most important, but it's somewhat the most intellectually let's say developable, or at least inquirable, scopable. I don't know how to say that. What the hell, this stupid vocabulary online. The one you can mostly, that the more you exercise fundamentally from a mental point of view, the more you can add new things. Because, of course, even in politics, in other social activities, there is much of this. You can look at the changing society in order to procure some benefits even to politics, and the way also wars therefore are waged. But the crucial point in here is understanding once again that there is nothing to do about it. War is just a political instrument, point. End of the story. And there is no other way out of that. So this is what reason brings to. And remember reason, because there is still instinct. Instinct tells you something else. Instincts tell you that basically you can go out there and still smash your enemy's skull with a club, like just the apes do. And well, yeah, that's attractive, that's seducing, that's what the instinct tell us, but we went far beyond that. It turns out that instinct as a rule in war gets crushed by reason, right? And therefore the organization of war all lies into this political dimension that is the one that most of all has to think at how to wage war practically, whether it's the case or not, whether it's hopefully some of the most reasonable, or at least the most reasonable in the Trinity of all the predominant tendencies which are into war itself, right? So in other words, politics has always the last say into the matter, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says that the first of these three phases concerns more the people, the second more the general and his army, the third more the government. So we already said it. So to rephrase it, basically hatred and animosity, this primordial violence, belong to the people. Interestingly enough, they don't belong to the military. There are culturalists, where still a bunch of not let me tell you what, that confuse this, that believe that fundamentally hatred and violence is just is a quality that those warriors have, right? So as if the military, because this is what the culturalists believe, that essentially the military is, and whoever wants to make war as as a sort of regular activity, that the whole thing is cultural, right? So basically, the military is just a bunch of assassins and psychopaths that even take lust at killing people. You can understand how stupid this conception is, but culturalism is unfortunately still out there, and surprise, is also what is more emotionally speaking, especially in these days, pushed, even if people do not know, have not even heard of that. The general approach to war really stems from the similar ideas. And guess why? Von Clausewitz is right. Because it pertains to the people, to the masses. That's why the first of these three phases concerns more the people. As von Clausewitz rightfully say, it's the people who is primordially violence, who is filled with hatred and animosity, right? What pertains actually to the general and his army, so to the military proper, is instead this kind of a more, even kind of more, at least this is the element of the Trinity that back in the day led me more to think, because it's kind of thought-provoking. What pertains to the military is the play of probabilities and chance. In other words, I don't know whether I interpreted fully correctly, but the concept is that, if you're somewhat part of the military, but not even effectively into it, it's like even the taste that we have, for example, in studying military history or war in general, is this fundamental curiosity. This idea of, let's see, it's a challenge, right? Because you don't know what the dice are going to turn. It's a game. It's this taste for just seeing what happens next, right? It has nothing to do with violence, right? So that, of course, the human being, the physical human being, the military man, the military historian, whoever, is filled also with the primordial element, as it's filled with reason. So the three things coexist within, not just within war, but in human nature in itself. This is very important to understand and to bear in mind when you study von Clausewitz. as actually most of Clausewitzian concepts is not never just about war. It's about human nature in itself. If you take this act of violence as the inherent conflictuality that pervades our existence, well, you can't understand much even about the human being in itself. So it's this taste for gaming. It's like when you're a kid, you like, I don't know, to just to play, to see what it, to discover new games, to do strange stuff. Even that is a very ingenious one, is actually a very important element of civilization. This lust for the unknown, right? We know it anthropologically speaking, biologically speaking. Human minds are attracted by chaos. Human minds work in order to kind of building a more solid base and treasuring a bunch of stuff, but they're never content with that. And what they want is really to throw themselves into chaos, and they are attracted by chaos. This is also power. It could be read in many ways, philosophically, religiously. Speaking, there are so many analogies you can do with that, and it sort of tell you that that civilization is born out of at least of a part of daring, right? Of bet, of risk that is entailed by this game in the first place, so that you can't have, and this is particularly important, very meaningful and deeply meaningful, that there can't be any civilization without risk. And this is dramatic, especially if you consider how war effectively improved civilization by itself. I mean, some of the greatest, achievements in medicine, in technology, in science broadly meant, actually were brutally accelerated by war. This is most evident into the conflicts of the 20th century, were particularly intense, but also minor ones triggered this but it is true. A war, in its risk, in its danger, is also what develops, not just by alone, also with many other human activities, but this is particular in many ways because of danger itself. Human ingenuity, and this can't be denied objectively from a historical point of view. You can say that wars can potentially also destroy civilizations. Of course they do, and they did. But at the same time, those who survived to tell the story actually were somehow enriched, if not materially, often, but still also in terms of intellectual or moral resources. So this is particularly important, and this is why I believe that even if we are extremely lucky not to live in a world now dominated by war, like it could have been during the world wars or other devastating conflicts, we still, however, lost in great part this sense of pressure, danger that can actually help us to find new solutions. If you're not pressured, you tend. This is also what von Clausewitz tells you, to soften up, right? To grow kind of lazy and not to do a great much with what you have, which may be actually even more than what you have when you're in trouble, obviously. And you don't, but it's exactly when you're in trouble that you grow resourceful. So this idea of the probabilities and chance has to be interpreted in this way. It's not a mere it starts sometimes from a mere lust for game, right? For gaming, but it's way deeper. It's written in our genes. It's meant for evolutionarily speaking to go on, to develop, to go out there and to find out new things, and maybe to fall in the enterprise, but at least having tried to expand, to improve. So it's particularly important and meaningful that this tendency belongs to the military, because it's the military that is on the field, and that is the one that has to play more than in any other human activity, how von Clausewitz puts it, the risk, right? That has the highest risk, and also the least information, so that there is in war, as a human activity, the highest combination of let's say of bet, the highest bet, which can be easily your life, and also the greatest amount of unknown, so that the bet is extremely risky, like, and the odds are also pretty much unknown. So you go out there without fundamentally knowing whether you will make it or not by a very large degree, and that's why it takes ingenuity, because even though much of this is still dominated by probability and chance, still you have the possibility to reduce, I mean to increase, in this sense, the probability and chance that things will go kind of better, right? So you can never do this in complete safety, but that's what keeps you alive and keeps you ingenious, and that's why also, I don't know, just to make a banal example, that's why an army of veterans is normally more at least intellectually resourceful than an army of rookies, because at one point there is also the kind of lack into also moral resources that are particularly important, but that we will talk that in another chapter. But I mean about this, human moral resources at a certain point get spent, right? You can't have a soldier that fights for all of his life. It's not realistic. Basically, we're not made to sustain more than a sum of 40 days of combat in an entire life. That's what they found out first in the hard way, or at least they rationalized it in that point during World War II. They had some of the finest veterans. This happened before Operation Overlord, or better during, because also the consequences were seen afterwards. That, I don't know, they had fantastic in the Allies. Allied troops, the Americans, the British had some pretty good troops, because they were veteran of places like Africa and Italy, and when before Overlord they were stationed in Britain, lots of and to be engaged into France. They were so they were so looked upon with such great expectation. Well, it turned out that when when Overlord was launched and these guys got on the ground, they underperformed, and they found out with certain studies, etc. Basically, they had spent their resources, they spent their energies, they were tired, they couldn't take it anymore, because war is also psychophysically, needless to say, very consuming, and human beings are not made to remain into that under that pressure for too long. At a certain point, the organism says, I can't, and it can't be even harmful at one point. So this is an anecdote I like to tell every once in a while that is pretty instructive. But there could be many other considerations also to make in the sense in the relation between soldier and warrior, and the evolution also of technology, etc. But maybe we'll leave that for another military history video, actually. For now, so we arrived at the generalist army, and the third of the Trinity. So reason pertains to government, as we said before. So it's expected the government, in the mechanisms in which it works and it's being created socially, politically, hierarchically, is meant to work in a way that basically distances in itself more than any other element of society from the instinctual dimension, right? From the instincts of hatred in animals, it instead reasons, tries to to approach mathematical thinking as much as possible. But we have seen that definitely it's not possible to reason mathematically in phenomena like war that are so excessively complicated no computer can calculate objectively, and nor there would be any war if we had the real solution for all of our the right solution for all of this. It's even difficult to put it in gnoseological. What is that we should know? What this action, because action is directly linked to the object, and the object is determined by what you want. And it turns out humans are not are largely not reasonable beings, and they will never be fully reasonable unless you don't alter their genetic patrimony, and therefore they're not humans anymore. But in this reality, it's impossible to achieve that. Then von Clausewitz says, the passions which break forth in war must already have a latent existence in the peoples. So this is definitely true. We have encountered this thought already along the chapter. Basically means that you can't, at least this is a prescription chiefly for politics, but not only, that you can't pretend that the war starts just like, the state decides to go to war, and so it is. We are social beings. Our societies are directed in ways that, but in which not even in the most effective totalitarian regime you could have an automatic commitment or impulse or drive or push for war that fundamentally doesn't that is not rooted into some previous feelings or passions that the people have. So this naturally tells you how much even the government is not just an abstract entity out there that decides whether war can be unleashed or not, but war is triggered by enormously complicated decisions that are the consequence of so many other also unexpected factors, and therefore from this follows that not even government, that should be the most reasonable of all the elements of the Trinity, is fully rationally guided, and it's impossible, right? And I don't know whether you could trace some parallelism now between the Trinities, like which is the one that acts with more conscience of itself. It's particularly difficult to tell, because there are these differences. What is that, who is essentially more aware of what he's doing? Is it the soldier on the field, or is it the politician at home, or the people in the street? It's particularly complicated to answer this, and I don't know whether von Clausewitz took into consideration, but it's obvious. His answer would be, and maybe I'm just forgetting about some parts I don't know, but it would be it depends. It depends fundamentally. What it matters in here is setting the fundaments of this Trinity for us to understand it, right? So it's what he's doing. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the range which the display of courage and talents shall get in the realm of probabilities and of chance depends on the particular characteristics of the general and his army, but the political objects belong to the government alone. Right? So the there is this ingenious dimension that we were talking about before, tied to the play of probabilities and chance. If you want the most daring element, in which also courage is required more than else, so that and this pertains to the military. So in other words, the military is, there is also the cliche, right, that the soldier is kind of someone with way more guts than the politician sitting at home, right, far from the battlefield. This could be, of course, when the differentiation is kind of extremized, it is true, but there are also moments in history where actually, the difference between the government and the military is not that big. Actually, we talk often about the Middle Ages, thinking about the ruling classes of feudal Europe, were normally meant to be, pretty warlike in their character, and they were. So it also depends on the degree of development of society. Generally speaking, the more society is developed and advanced, the more it gets articulated, and so the more there is it grows specialized, right? More primitive societies have everything into kind of together, right? So that talking about the difference between the warrior and the soldier, it's obvious that in a tribal context there are no soldiers. There are just warriors, right? So the chieftain, that is someone who is usually chosen not just because of his military prowess, but also because of his wisdom, is not surprisingly so, because in that figure he embodies both part of the military and the government for what the government shall mean into a tribal context. So, and this is embarrassingly realistic as a description, because it's literally what happened in this historical context. So the Clausewitzian theory is remarkably correct and accurate and realistic, and you can read it in every single historical example as such, and you will never find it disproved or not corresponding to reality in this sense. So that's what makes it so great and so necessary in order to understand war in itself. So here we had stopped a little second on the general and his army that represent this more courageous and talentuous element, right? Courageous because they're the ones who, at least for, first than all the other people get confronted with danger, with death, with violence, with bloodshed, and therefore courage is an essential requirement. But also the talent is fundamental, because here you can't be just courageous. If we were just courageous, we will all basically run against the enemy to get chopped down. You need talent. That is, you need also in here ingenuity and capacity to understand the situation. That's what leadership entails, and that's why it's so deeply intertwined with politics in itself. So that you have to find intelligent solutions to win a war, and not just being courageous. Warriors are courageous, but that's not enough, because the warrior in front of a soldier can be courageous as much as he likes, but gets killed, right? If he doesn't find other ways for which the soldier already knows, because it's been heavily trained and disciplined, and that has been given this kind of strongly rational character. Even maybe he's just trained to follow, right? Not to really think by himself, but he's still part of a system that in itself is way more intelligent than what the bunch of tribes of warlike societies are by themselves. So, I mean warlike from terms of warrior-like societies. So naturally there is no sharp division between the two. It's like you say, think about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. It's obvious that the Romans were way more rational in their in their mindset, in their organization, way more advanced as a society, etc. So you say, oh well, then how did Arminius won this? Because he was, he was a true warrior. He was not like a soldier. He was kind of more. He was kind of better, like because he was cooler. Because warriors are better than soldiers. No, Arminius won that battle because he was smart. In other words, because he made a very good use of reason, or at least in the limits in which human reasons can within the which can operate, and chose some best conditions that if Germans had met the Romans in open field, they would have been annihilated. It doesn't matter how courageous and talented that they and courageous and proud, etc. they were. Nobody puts that into discussion, but it's not what made the difference. The difference that was made by political calculation, because even putting all those tribes together is not something you can do just because people are courageous. It was a miracle in the Germany of 1st century AD, given the degree of basically any lack of central government at that point. So that's still not just obviously the reasonable element, but great part of it is it's that as well. Then there is also an art. There is also another kind of intelligence that we will see now in following chapters, but it's still something different. So von Clausewitz here is saying that the general and his army can be courageous and talented as much as you want, but the political object still belongs to the government alone. So that generally and his army can be as good as they can, but if the political mandate says to call them off, that's the order, right? And also history here is full of examples that I think we are not even here to list now, but it's evident that wars do not have to be understood just in terms of that cannot actually be understood just in terms of people who lost were actually, I don't know, less courageous. Because the idea now is that I've heard frequently around that if you lose battles, it's because you're a coward. So this is the typical culturalist / warrior like delusion that wars are won because people are more courageous than others, right? Or peoples are more courageous than others, which is at the limit of racism, frankly. It happens fortunately that it's not, or unfortunately by the way, that is not the case. I believe more fortunately, because I kind of estimate more intelligent people than courageous people, but at the same time you can't exclude one another. Just bear in mind that it's intelligence what actually makes the difference, and still also intelligence can not be enough to win a war still, right? There are some even material dimensions. It also depends on the odds, but the moral of the story is that human beings are fundamentally all homogeneous in terms of moral resources. Like military history brilliantly teaches us that it doesn't matter what you look like, what's the color of your skin, what's the size of your body. If you're properly trained, okay, well, yes, there are also in the military some body, physical limits, stuff like that, of course. But at the end of the day, human beings all fight in the same way and individual courage is boundless, as much as cowardice. So, even the same people can actually take different paths depending on the situation, because everything is that complicated. But there is an astonishing homogeneity in there. So it's not about how courageous you are or talented you are, but it depends on much greater factors that actually mostly depends not even just from the military or its leadership that definitely has a big importance, but even more by politics. I would say that I would go as far as saying that all the great the greatest military defeats, most of the times, statistically, an overwhelming majority of them were, first of all, political failures before the military ones, because it's kind of unfrequent, tendentially, that a very well structured and determined and organized army that has the right direction, has a very clear view of the situation, etc., gets defeated by someone who is not, right? So it's a matter of statistics, and you can't take that out of the equation. There is a passage in which von Clausewitz calls for this, says, there are it's very difficult sometimes to effectively identify the relation cause and effect in war, because most of the times we don't really know how it is gone. Even when things are finished and when people have studied these things, etc., we still kind of make conjectures. But for the sake of theory, and therefore also of a concrete application, hopefully, what you have to look at is at the experience, that is the results of all the systems, so that you can spot some trends that tell you that generally humans fighting in groups work in a certain sense, right? And there are certain factors that are maybe in that specific one not really always the same, or of course there's not a dominating one. It's like these predominant tendencies now, as von Clausewitz calls them, that intervene into the matter. But still, you can know that you can't circumscribe, you can narrow it down to some to these tendencies, right? In a broader sense. Then if you go into detail, that there is also the matter of the actual perspective, because if you go von Clausewitz, by the way, is very interesting, because it says that overly detailed inquiries are kind of damaging for the general understanding. I will use this for for those who for my crusade against hyper-specialization. But it's very meaningful. I mean, if you go too much into the detail and start looking at that, your mind kind of loses the orientation. And the same goes in war, because interestingly enough, there is this very strong and important parallelism between the art of warfare and military history that should actually be beneficial one to the other, respectively, because they respectively give one the object of let's say of studying, of understanding to each other, right? And therefore, even in action, I mean, in real war, details are not important. That's why there is a hierarchy, so that the guy at the top doesn't have to bother himself with all the nuisances that happen in this massive systems of the divisions or corps or armies, all this stuff. And obviously look at the thing from the top, reasoning from what that level, and that's obviously lacking the understanding of all the elements, and therefore making a sort of an approximation that spite of kind of ignoring certain elements, is still the best practical way you can get through that. So you can't avoid making mistakes, you can't know everything, it's all so foggy, and that's what the theory of fog of war comes from, but it's still the best way to make it work, right? So these are all concepts that they're extremely pragmatic. Here, von Clausewitz was an extremely pragmatic person. People would conceive him just as a theorist, as if what he's writing is just a sort of abstract matter of opinion. I actually haven't understood really what his aim is, which is to criticize exactly that perspective. This is to say, it's useless to conceive war as if, we could take into consideration literally everything that happened, because at that point we wouldn't even live into a reality. In reality, these things do not happen. So if you want to win a war, you have to follow certain paths that are, by approximate, are still the best ways you have to reach your goals, right? And trying to find them out through the work, naturally, and actually making it. So where were we now? Yeah, that was this general rephrasing of the three tendencies. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, these three tendencies, which appear like so many different lawgivers, are deeply rooted in the nature of the subject and at the same time variable in degree. Now this is fantastic, because these three tendencies are equated to three different lawgivers. So in actual fact, these are not just tendencies randomly influencing the system, but they are actually the ones that define how the subject works, that give the rule, in the way that give the law, actually the law proper. So this is not even something you can evade from. It's not like saying, it's a rule that, intelligence defeats instinct, because sometimes, as few as they can be, the rule is broken in here. The instinct can prevail over reason in the outcome of war, and therefore it's not a law but a rule. But these three tendencies that we have listed are effectively lawgivers. So it's as if they trace the actual boundaries into which the subject into which war is defined. And as they are deeply rooted in the nature of war, as we have just read, and at the same time, however, variable in degree. So there is even this degree of proportionality in some fashion. We have observed, for instance, that for war to kind of tend towards the most violent form, that you need also a greater animosity and political commitment. So there is this somewhat space that is always filled with one of the elements, right? That never come apart. They're never frameable into other dimensions out of these, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says a theory which would leave any one of them, of these three tendencies, out of account, or set up any arbitrary relation between them, would immediately become involved in such a contradiction with the reality that it might be regarded as destroyed at once by that alone. Which, to say it in other words, if you have other ways to put this, if you think that there are other elements that intervene, or that you can somewhat alter the foundation of this Trinity, the Trinity in itself, reality doesn't respond to you anymore. So if you think that war is just reason without instinct, or without taste for gaming, or the respective combinations of all this relations, you can't without just one of them. This is not reality. This is not how real wars are. And if you are to fight one of them thinking like that, most likely you will get annihilated. If you don't set up your mind straight, because the point of this considerations is not just to convince people that this is the case, which is also one of the reasons why he writes, but it's about really describing you how it is, even if people who do it have not really understood it yet. This is particularly meaningful because this was an age, in fact, in which this theory had not been developed yet. But what von Clausewitz is saying here is that, aside me from being a genius and having found out how it is, actually he was way more modest, of course. Was a particularly modest person. Still, if you look into history, even if this concept has not been rationalized or nobody had expressed it, that still wars worked in that way. So even if you don't believe it, when you're on the field or you have to take the political decision, it's still how it works. It's still how reality pushes you to understand it, to make it work, at least. So it's not a matter of going straight from a manual. Von Clausewitz is not giving you a manual to tell, here's the right formula, just follow it, you win a war. Von Clausewitz tells you that such formulas do not exist. He's just telling you that what happens in that fashion. So the best way for you to win a war is just be aware of that. Because otherwise you can commit such gross misunderstandings that you're not even able to start it. But this was, by the way, a work that, the Vom Kriege was written with a broader aim, naturally. But what is fascinating is that this read was loved by civilians more than the military men at the beginning. So it's particularly important to even think at the historical context in here, in which there was a bourgeoisie rising and was a popular one. And it belonged to what the politics of the countries was being about. So this work was not just meant to, as a manual for the military, because the military, albeit having certain misunderstandings, of course, intellectually, etc., was still operating in that fashion. What here arguably had a much greater impact was the awareness of the masses of this theory. Then I'm not sure whether it really had, but some of the greatest, in the ways it was hoped, but still, even in politically speaking, Clausewitzian theory was applied extremely successfully in some of the most important and history-changing events in the 19th and 20th century, in obviously even beyond. So it's von Clausewitz is revealing. Now we'll see at the end of the paragraph also what he says in metaphorically is very fascinating. It gives you exactly that sense. These three tendencies of the Trinity are lawgivers, right? They effectively dictate how war is gonna go, or is gonna work at least. Von Clausewitz goes on saying, we have already read that any other option is destined to any other understanding of war is destined to be crushed by reality, and that's why he goes so heavily. He plays so heavily on it, because it says, if you think of war anything differently, not just you become involved in a contradiction with the reality, but reality itself can destroy this misunderstanding immediately, already by itself, even without for you to learn the lesson. It kind of gives you the kind of examines you before giving you the lessons, before teaching you. So it's pretty hard. Then going on, he writes, the problem is therefore that theory shall keep itself poised in a manner between these three tendencies as between 3 points of attraction. So here we go back on the concept of theory that has always to remain balanced, right? So that you can't really tell that every war has this specific relations, say this specific measures and degrees in the relations between the three elements, right? But you always know that the three elements are always there. So the theory, at least, that is the one that should keep things balanced, to more or less keep you aware of certain things, should always be poised in between these three tendencies, always taking them simultaneously into consideration and not losing sight of any of them, because otherwise it loses a vital part and the thing breaks down, right? So in conclusion, this last phrase, the way in which alone this difficult problem, so the one of figuring out in which what in each war is going to happen, or is happening at least, or trying to figure it out at best, can be solved, we shall examine in the book on the theory of war, which is the second book, by the way. In every case, the conception of war, as here defined, will be the first ray of light which shows us the true foundation of theory, and which first separates the great masses and allows us to distinguish them from one another. So this is brilliant, because it tells you the way of finding out how to fight a war, in other words, is particularly complex, and we will observe it especially in the second book of the work. But in any case, the conception of war, as here defined, so what we have read up to now in the first chapter that finishes here, will be the first ray of light which shows us the true foundation of theory. In this chapter we have looked essentially at the foundation of theory. We basically have not engaged into any in any practical dimension. Here we're still define theory as it is, but it's not an abstract theory. As a matter of fact, the whole chapter starts from a fully abstract picture to show you how unrealistic it is, to get to this very much more concrete theory, that is the one that you can apply into reality. Now we will try to see from the second chapter, from the second book, and then now we will see other things in the meanwhile, how this can be translated into reality. In other words, how you command an army, or however, what are the, I mean, not literally meant, but or at least, yeah, there is some hint even about that, but in how the army works on the field, and what the two fighters are involved in, you know, in the clash, etc. But this is the true foundation of theory, or otherwise the true foundation of theory, meaning that there can't be any other correct theory out of these foundations, because these are the ones that are grounded into reality. The other ones are just grounded somewhere very unstable that doesn't work. So, and which first separates the great masses and allows us to distinguish them from one another. So, to make the long story short, this is what you need to first get the essentials, right? The fundamentals, and we will go on eventually. So, with this video, now it's beautiful that we could spend even some words about the general chapter that has just concluded. But I think that first of all, if you have followed now all the you've started at least to be well acquainted with Clausewitzian dialectics, logics, etc. And it's perfectly it's very simple, it's very fluid, it's very easy to follow. It's also very beautiful to read, actually. You find how von Clausewitz, albeit being capable of very poetical and plastic and thought-provoking explanations, he's always sticks to the point. He's always with his feet on the ground. He's always telling you what really works. Like he's intellectually honest. He's showing you, even sort of anatomically speaking, all of the elements that make up this theory. He's explaining you step by step every single logical ring of the chain, and it's bringing you forward at every time. There is nothing that he writes that that in that specific step is just anecdotal, or a simple repetition of what he has said before, that doesn't bring forward something new at every step, right? He repeats his concepts a lot, because he's also a didactic method to make you understand clearly, to revive your to stimulate your memory, to always make you understand clearly what he's talking about. But he always takes the next step forward, and that is very, very fascinating. And in terms of the contents, I don't think now we can repeat them all, but also the essential, I think, are pretty clear. And we have arrived to the point in which we can legitimately now start observing other questions in detail, that we will start doing with the second chapter, chapter 2, end and means in war, right? So this is going to be increasingly interesting, because this is how the Vom Kriege is really like. And we'll see it, of course, from next time. So, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.